External restrictions caused the need for fine-tuning. God finely tuned the universe. Therefore, God is bound by external restrictions.
This is an argument I've been hearing from skeptics lately, and I find it extremely unconvincing. The general aim is to say that because God finely tuned the universe, this means God was limited when he created it, because he had to obey certain restrictions and could not have brought life about any other way. So he really isn't omnipotent and is bound by external restrictions. However, the problem with this argument is it assumes too much. Although external restrictions cause the need for fine-tuning, the evidence of fine-tuning, which is all we have, doesn't automatically entail that God was bound by external restrictions. So the argument fails on that point. Basically, the evidence of fine-tuning doesn't always entail external restrictions. A designer can also finely tune for personal preference or for personal reasons. For example, let's say a scientist wants to build a computer, but then finely tunes it to only function at 76 degrees. This doesn't mean the scientist was bound by external restrictions to create the computer to only survive at a certain temperature. It means he chose to for his own personal reasons. The only logical restriction the scientist would have is that he had to build a computer to actually call it a computer. He couldn't build a log cabin and call it a computer. Beyond that, he can then finely tune it however he pleases. Likewise, when God created life, the only logical restriction he had was that it had to be living. Besides that, God can then finely tune however he pleases. So when God finely tuned the universe, there is no observable evidence to suggest that the reason was because of external restrictions that forced his hand, other than pure speculation. The reason the universe was finely tuned could have been because of personal preference or personal reasons. And since God is omnipotent by definition, then the reason cannot be because of external restrictions. We also have to remember that the laws of physics, which require the universe to be so finely tuned, were also created by God. So the laws that require the universe to be a certain way were also created by God and wouldn't necessarily be external restrictions for him. So there is no evidence to think the external restrictions that require fine-tuning affect God as well. Now at this point, skeptics will argue, well, why would God create the universe like he did and require so much fine-tuning? Why not create it a simpler way? Well, basically, theists could postulate any number of theodicies to answer this question, but it wouldn't matter even if we couldn't, because the defense I just presented shows that evidence of fine-tuning doesn't always entail external restrictions. But if I was going to postulate a few theodicies, one could argue the universe was created this way because it leaves obvious evidence of a designer, which God would ultimately want. One could also argue the amount of fine-tuning required for our existence shows how fragile our existence is, which creates a humbling experience for us and reminds us we are not gods ourselves. But at the end of the day, I prefer how Dr. Craig handles this.
He says that God's omnipotence could just create the universe out of nothing. Why fine-tune it? He's not very efficient. Efficiency, ladies and gentlemen, is an important value only for someone with either limited time or limited resources, or both. God is not limited in time or resources. I think the problem is that he's thinking of God from the perspective of the engineer. But suppose God is more like the artist or the gourmet chef who enjoys the delight of creating a beautiful universe. I don't think we can presume to tell God how he ought to create the universe.
When it comes down to the basic implications, God can go about creating the universe any way he artistically pleases. The idea that he was bound by external restrictions simply assumes too much.